I'm stating for the record, today's date is June 12th, 2016 at VFW Post 6393. I'm interviewing Bill Oudenne. Mr. Oudenne's date of birth is April 30th, 1925. My name is Jacob Leibowitz, and I'm conducting this interview as part of Christian White's Eagle Scout project, Voices of LMT Veterans. Mr. Oudenne served in the U.S. Army during World War II. His rank was Private First Class, and he served in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Where were you living at the time?
In Belmead, New Jersey, Somerset County.
Okay. What was your life like before the military experience?
What was my life like before the military?
Yes.
I was going to high school. I got as far as a junior year, completed that, and then I was drafted.
What were you feeling when you were drafted?
A bit overwhelmed, I would say. I had hoped to finish my high school. I asked for a deferment, but it wasn't granted.
Did you have any thoughts of not going into the service?
No. No, I just was somewhat unhappy because I couldn't finish my high school.
Yeah. Do you recall your first days in the service?
My first day in the service?
Yes.
Yes, very definitely. Yeah.
Okay, what did it feel like?
A bit of a loss, and it was kind of a shocking experience. I'd never been away from home before.
Tell me about your boot camp / training experience or experiences.
Well, I started out in Fort Dix, New Jersey, and it was really a reception center, so there wasn't any particular training going on except learning how to march and salute. That was about it. And it was there for perhaps a week or 10 days, and then I was shipped out to Camp Davis, North Carolina.
Okay.
And that's where I had my basic training.
Okay. Do you remember your instructors for the basic training?
No.
Do you feel that the youth today have the same sense of duty to their country as you did in your generation?
I can only suppose they do. I don't really know.
Okay. What places did you go once you completed your basic training, I guess?
Well, my unit, which was an anti-aircraft unit, was sent to Camp Gordon, Georgia, which was an advanced infantry replacement center. And the unit, as we knew it, was disbanded, and we all became infantry soldiers.
Okay.
And we remained there for a few weeks, and then some of us were shipped to one place and others to another, and I found myself in California, Camp Hahn, part of a I think it was the 139th 90 millimeter gun artillery battalion.
Do you remember what arriving at the camp in California was like?
Yes, I remember it quite well. It was pleasant compared to the swamp areas where I'd been in the south. The climate was much nicer. I didn't realize, however, at the time that this was a port of embarkation.
What was your job or assignment in your division?
At what point?
When you started out and were shipped?
Oh, when I started out, I was in communications. I was in the telephone wire stringing operation, climbing poles, stringing wires, that kind of thing. And then I became the battalion switchboard operator, and also a radio operator after that.
Okay. Did you see any battle? Combat?
Only from a distance. I was very fortunate.
Okay. Were there many casualties in your unit, or just
We had a few. We had a few, but that happened because we're kind of jumping ahead here. When I got on the ship, we sailed through the Solomons and the Marshall Islands, and we ended up at one of the southernmost points of New Guinea. And we sat there for a week or so waiting for a convoy to form. And then the convoy slowly progressed up to Leyte, Philippine Islands. At that point, the Leyte, which had been a major battle of the Southwest Pacific at the time, had been pretty well secured. I told Chris I would bring a Yank magazine here you might look at, because we weren't allowed to have cameras, which was unfortunate. Some guys apparently did sneak some in, but I didn't have the nerve to do it. But this is what happened the night I got in Leyte. It looks a lot worse than it is. Actually, it was a Japanese bomber that was coming over to bomb the airfield in Tagalog, which incidentally, where we landed was the same place that General MacArthur landed when he initially went into the Philippines in around October of 1945.
Okay.
Now, we didn't stay there very long. We stayed there, I guess, maybe 5 or 6 weeks, and then all of a sudden, one fine day, we got orders to be ready to move out about 5 o'clock in the morning, and the 139 Gun Battalion at that point also was disbanded. Some were sent one way and some another. All I recall was being loaded up on a truck, taken to the Tagalog airfield, loaded onto C-47 aircraft, and flown to Biak, then Morotai, then Hollandia, New Guinea, and eventually to Milne Bay, New Guinea, which is almost the southern tip closest to Australia. And there I suddenly found that I became a truck driver, 10-wheel truck. And the reason apparently for that big change was that the war had progressed pretty well by that time. The Leyte was completely secured, Mindanao was secured, and the Solomons and Marshalls, those had all been secured. But there were a very large, where we were in Milne Bay was a large supply base for the forward units that were moving up. And one of the things that remained there were, well, it looked like thousands of 55-gallon drums of high-octane gas for aircraft. And our job literally was to move those from the, they were just laying out there in the open, as far as you could see, rows and rows of these drums. And we would be loaded with about 12 of them. That equaled about 3 tons of high-octane gas. And then we would drive that over to a harbor, to an awaiting Liberty ship usually, where they were loaded on board, and then moved up the line wherever they were going. A lot of it, I assume, was going to Iwo Jima and subsequently Okinawa. But of course, a lot of it went to the Philippines too, because they had a force that remained there and had to be supplied. We were there, trying to think back, maybe 3 or 4 months, and the next thing I know, we were loaded on another ship, which was what they called a personnel assault ship with the invasion barges, and we sailed up the coast of New Guinea to Hollandia, which was a major base at the time. That's where MacArthur was at his headquarters for quite some time. And we waited there for about a week under the tropical sun on the terrible heat, very uncomfortable, waiting for that convoy to form. And then finally, when it formed, we said that the ships all set sail, and there were 2 destroyers in front of us because the Japanese submarines were still quite active in that part of the ocean, and so they were providing, they were the guards for us, more or less, to get our convoy through. And we ended up in Luzon, and we disembarked into invasion barges, and we sailed into Manila. But fortunately, that had been pretty well secured, so it was a very quiet reception for us. And I was really awestruck by the destruction, because prior to that, I was always in the jungle, so you don't realize much about destruction until you get to a civilized area and you can see what the war has actually done. The Philippines was a very beautiful, Manila was the capital of the Philippines. It was a very beautiful city. At the time, the general, I forget his name, it was a Japanese general, had ordered all his troops out and declared the city an open city in respect for the architecture of Manila. They didn't want to see it destroyed, but there was one overzealous officer who decided that he would stay there and fight to the end, and he and about 20,000 Japanese soldiers fought fanatically and resulted in the destruction of the city almost total, including the old Intramuros city. Intramuros was the original city built by the Spanish. It was surrounded by very thick walls. They looked to be about 10 or 12 feet thick. And they had a beautiful cathedral there and some other very nice buildings. And most of it got blasted. Fortunately, the cathedral survived. But the city was thoroughly destroyed. While we were stationed there, this was Luzon. That's where the capital of the Philippines is, on Luzon, Manila, Luzon. We suddenly heard that one guy, I remember my unit, came in and said they had just dropped a bomb with the force of 10,000 tons of dynamite. And I said, oh, you got your numbers wrong. It must be 10,000 pounds, not 10,000 tons. But it turned out it was the atomic bomb, and it was considerably more. The destruction that it was able to wreak equal to more than 10,000 tons, more like 20,000 tons in Hiroshima and then subsequently Nagasaki, and that was the end of the war. We then found ourselves shipped up to a place called Batangas, which is the northern part of Luzon, and we were loaded on a Liberty ship. Liberty ships were never intended to carry troops. They were strictly for cargo. Very primitive setup. There were no showers, no toileting facilities, nothing fancy. We had to take our folding cots and place them. We were put down in the bottom deck. I guess it was the second deck of the ship, and open up our cots, and that's where we would sleep during the voyage. They held us up there for about 7 days because it was typhoon season, and apparently the weather forecast had suggested that there was one about to hit. They kept us there for 7 days on that ship, and then finally they let us go, and everything was pretty quiet. And then all of a sudden one night, incidentally, sleeping down in that hold was very uncomfortable, and I decided, since my truck was secured on a hatch cover on deck, to go up into my truck and sleep on the seat. And this one particular night, we were out about 5 or 6 nights, and I had fallen sound asleep, and suddenly I was awakened from a very sound sleep, and I found myself, I had fallen among the levers. These trucks had about 3 or 4 different levers and so on.
Yes.
And I was down in there on the floor. And as I managed to get myself up a bit to look out the windshield, all I could see was water. The ship had completely turned to the point where it was about ready to keel, to turn over completely. Fortunately, it didn't. It caught itself, or a wave came along and righted it, and back we went the other way.
Oh my.
We had run into the outskirts of the typhoon, which we were supposed to miss by waiting a week. We would have missed it if we had gone straight ahead. The result of that was a great disappointment to me, because we arrived in Yokohama Bay in Japan one day after General MacArthur and the forces of all the countries that were fighting against Japan, and of course the Japanese themselves, were on the battleship Missouri to sign the surrender forms. So we missed that by one day, which was very unfortunate for me. That's essentially the story. And then after that, I thought we were going to disembark in Yokohama, but we didn't. The next thing we knew, our ship got underway, and we went up the northern coast of Japan to a place called Sendai, and that's where we disembarked. We remained there for a couple of weeks. I don't know, in those days they didn't tell the soldiers where they were going. Today, these fellows usually they're told where they're going, but we never knew. You just got on the ship and you had no idea where you'd end up. We were there for maybe a week or two, and the next thing you know, we were transferred on to LSTs, landing ship tanks, those LSTs.
Yes.
And back we went to Yokohama, the place we had just come from. And we disembarked there, and we remained, and that's where I remained for, I guess about 4 or 5 months in the initial Army of Occupation of Japan, until time, they told me that, okay, you're going home. And that was it, essentially.
Okay. Such. How did you stay in touch with your family?
In those days, we used what was known as V-mail. You familiar with it at all?
I'm not. Can you explain?
Well, it was an attempt to facilitate the Army Post Office movement of mail from all these different fronts, because remember, this was a world war. It was around the whole globe. And so you would write your letter on a piece of paper, whatever you had, and put it in an envelope and address it. And then it went to some place, I don't know where it was open and it was read. And if there was, and incidentally, this was all the time that I was overseas, and everybody else who was overseas went through the same thing. It would go through your letters, and anything that the censors thought might be of use to the enemy was crossed out or cut out of the letter. And I always made it my business never to write anything that was of any significance, but still no. Every once in a while my folks would say that my letter had a lot of it crossed out. I couldn't imagine why, but this is what happened. So that's how we kept in touch.
Okay. What was the food like?
What was the food?
Yes, what was it like?
Well, it was fair. I was more fortunate because being in a trucking company, we were behind the front lines. So we had cooked food, although a lot of it was dehydrated potatoes, dehydrated this and all, that kind of stuff. And then as we were moving up, then we got these D rations, which consisted of a bar of chocolate and some candies and cans of scrambled eggs or whatever it was for the particular meal. Matter of fact, on the Liberty ship I was on, that's what we subsisted on all during that trip.
Did you feel any pressure or stress?
During the typhoon, I felt a great deal. I really thought that was good. That was the end of it for me. I was the one time that I was truly, truly frightened during the war. I didn't think I'd come out of that. That was a very stressful experience.
I could imagine.
I spent, in total, I had figured it out once I lost the record or whatever I had. I spent nearly 3 months on the ocean while I was in the Pacific, going on one ship to the other, going here and then going back, including 12 hours on an airplane, flying me back to a place where we just come from. So I spent a lot of time traveling, crossed the equator 4 times, and the international dateline twice, which you had to do to get to New Guinea and then go back home again.
Was there something special you did for good luck or for any other reason?
Anything that I did for good luck?
Yes.
No.
How did you and your fellow soldiers entertain yourselves?
Oh, in New Guinea, there was no USO or anything like that. So it was playing cards. Just hearts was a favorite game, playing hearts. And we didn't play for money, strangely enough. One of the big entertainments for a lot of them was rolling dice, and they they rolled the dice for money. I was quite impressed when we were in Japan, saw some of these guys would be in a circle on their knees or tossing the dice, and they would throw a fistful of yen. That's the Japanese currency. They throw a whole fistful down. Okay, who's going to cover me? And then another guy throw 2 fistfuls. They didn't know how much money they were throwing in there. I kept out of that. But that was the entertainment. There wasn't anything else.
Oh, okay. So, where did you travel again in your service? Just like...
Well, if you want to start from the beginning, I ended up going from Fort Dix, New Jersey to North Carolina, from North Carolina to Florida, from Florida to Georgia, from Georgia to California, from California to New Guinea, from New Guinea up to Leyte, from Leyte back to New Guinea again, from being back in New Guinea to the island of Luzon in the Philippines, and then from there to Japan, and from there to Seattle when I was repatriated after I was discharged.
Okay.
So a lot of time spent traveling.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Courtesy of my uncle.
Do you recall any particularly unusual events while in your service?
Well, being in New Guinea was there were unusual events there. I saw a lot of snakes. So first time I ever saw land crabs, which are about this size, and it was kind of scary to me because I'd never seen one of these things. And what the scariest part of it was that they scooted sideways. They didn't come, they'd be looking at you. You'd think they'd come straight, but they'd go sideways. And then I also saw rats that were about 2 feet long when I would be driving at night. They'd be running across a jungle road. And the natives, with their big hairdos, the primitive natives, they were still practicing cannibalism when I was in New Guinea.
Oh my.
Oh yeah. That went on some years after.
Yeah. What did you think of your fellow officers and fellow soldiers?
Well, there were all kinds. I had more contact with officers in the United States than I did overseas. In the United States, some were real gentlemen, they were real decent types, and others, let their rank go to their heads a little bit. Overseas, it was entirely different. Everything was very informal. We never had to dress formally like we did in the United States. You wore a regular uniform. But overseas, we wore our fatigues, and that was it. I mean, it was nobody was after you to say your neckties on crooked or you didn't button up your shirt right. Anything at all went. You wore your shirt or you didn't wear it. That was up to you.
Did you keep a diary?
I beg your pardon? No, I didn't keep a diary.
Okay. Do you recall the day that your service ended?
Yes, March the 6th, 1946.
All right, where were you at this time?
In Fort Dix, because I was shipped back from Japan to Seattle, and then from Seattle by train back to Fort Dix, where that was the place where I was initially inducted, and that was also the place from which I was discharged.
All right. What did you do in the days and weeks following?
For a couple of weeks, I did literally nothing. Just took it easy. I lived out in the country, and which I always enjoyed. I used to go on walks with my dog. Didn't have a car. Didn't even have a bicycle. So living out in the country, there wasn't much opportunity to go anywhere. We didn't have the transportation. But then I did, after I was home, I guess a couple of weeks, I got somebody to take me to a special, I forget what they call the office. It was connected somehow with the federal government for discharged veterans to find out what your rights were as a soldier. And that's where I learned about the GI Bill. And having learned about that, I then tried to enroll in different universities, but unfortunately, there were so many hundreds of thousands of guys who got out of the service long before I did, because they had more points. One of the fairest systems that I recall the Army had, and I was fair from many points of view, was that for every month that you were in the service, you got 1 point. For every month that you were overseas, you earned 2 points. For every combat star, I got 1, you got 5 more points. So there were a lot of guys, who'd been in the service and overseas 2 and 3 years. I was only over there for a little year and a quarter, something like that. So they were way ahead of me. And then, of course, the European theater, a lot of them were coming home from there. So the colleges were pretty well flooded. It was tough to get into any place. So I ended up going to Rider College. They accepted me even though I didn't have my college. I didn't graduate from high school, but the high school did give me the diploma because I had earned enough credits to qualify for that. And being a veteran, they made an exception. And I was lucky enough to enroll in Rider University. It was Rider College, and now it's Rider University in New Jersey.
Was your education supported by the GI Bill?
Yes, it was. That is the undergraduate. Graduate degree I paid myself.
Did you make any close friendships when you were in the service?
Yes, a number of them. Mm-hmm.
Did you continue any of these relationships?
No. Everybody was. I was with guys who were from all over the United States. Just lost track of them.
What did you go on to as a career after the war?
Okay. I tried to get a job after I graduated from college, and I became assistant business manager of the New Jersey State Diagnostic Center, and continued my career in the Department of Human Services, New Jersey Department of Human Services. And finally retired as assistant director of the Division of Developmental Disabilities.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about war and about the military in general?
Yes, it did. You want my comment on war?
If you'd like.
Well, my comment on war, very simply, is that it's the ultimate form of insanity, because no other human activity requires nations to sacrifice the cream of the crop of their youth and to waste its capital and its cultural treasure on destroying each other.
Do you attend reunions?
No, I haven't been aware of any.
How did your service and experiences affect your life?
Well, I guess you'd say I went in as a kid, and I guess I came out somewhat grown up. It changed my mind a lot about what civilization is like and what culture is all about.
Do you feel people today should go into the military service?
I think that depends on the individual. If you you have a desire for that sort of thing, why not? I think a lot of young folks probably would benefit from it, frankly. I really do. Because, when I think back when I got out, I was drafted out of high school, so I didn't have the opportunity to say, well, after I graduated from high school, I didn't really know what to do. But, frankly, if I had gone through high school and graduated, I don't know, what I would have. I would have tried to get a job, almost any kind of a job. But you're very undecided as to what you want to do. After you've been in the military, you become more mature. You've gotten somewhat older, and you've met a whole lot of different kinds of people, which you never had the opportunity before. Now, of course, with you young folks today, you get around a lot more than we did. I was a country hick. Lived out in the sticks, no car, no way to get around. So I was very limited socially. Whereas you folks today have far more experience in that regard.
Is there anything you'd like to add that we did not cover in the interview?
I can't think of anything offhand. No, I think you've done a pretty good job of covering it all.
All right, well, thank you.